A single fractured papyrus scroll lies on a cedar table, its edges frayed like the empire it represents. On it, the hieroglyphs trace the first recorded peace treaty in human history, a pact between Ramesses II and the Hittites. But the ink is barely dry before the hand that authorized it begins to fail. Ramesses, a man who commanded the sun to rise and the Nile to flood, now struggles with the simple mechanical act of drawing breath. His skin, once anointed with the finest oils of punt, is now a map of translucent wrinkles, smelling of myrrh and the impending bitterness of the tomb. The paradox of Egypt is etched into the very grain of its monuments. To ensure one man lived forever, an entire generation had to be consumed by the present. We see the towering colossi and call it greatness. But from a structural perspective, these were not just temples. They were massive gravity wells of human labor, designed to stabilize a power structure that feared its own evaporation. The state did not just tax the grain, it taxed the very time and muscle of its people to build anchors against the void of the afterlife. This raises a tension that history rarely resolves. Was the splendor of the old and new kingdoms a peak of human collective achievement, or was it a sophisticated, multi-millennial survival strategy for a ruling class obsessed with its own obsolescence? We are left to wonder if the civilization we admire was a triumph of the spirit or a relentless machinery of stone designed to outrun the silence of the sand. Today, the prevailing consensus among archaeologists, based on the discovery of worker villages and skeletal remains, suggests these monuments were not the work of whips and chattel, but of a highly organized, state-led labor force. Yet, the debate continues. Did this system represent a social contract of divine protection, or a mandatory extraction of life that left the common man with nothing but a shallow grave in the dust? If the immortality of the few required the exhaustion of the many, what does that say about the true cost of civilization? The Nile is not a river in the way we understand geography today. It is a pulse. In the Fayum Basin, the air is thick with the scent of wet earth and the sharp, metallic tang of sweat. A farmer named Hori presses his weight into the black mud, his skin baked to the color of the clay he shapes. For him, the silt under his fingernails is the only bank account that matters. If the river's rise is shy by just a few palms, the grain silos will hollow out, and his children will be reduced to chewing boiled leather. If it oversteps, his mud brick world simply dissolves back into the marsh. But this fragility was the very engine of Egyptian power. The uncertainty of the flood created a vacuum that only a totalizing system could fill. To the north, white limestone blocks from the Tura quarries sit low in the water on heavy barges, their sheer mass defying the current. The rhythm of the rowers is not governed by a clock, but by the relentless geometry of the state's ambition. This was a world where logistics and theology were indistinguishable. The infrastructure of the pyramids was not merely a construction project, it was a psychological harness. If the pharaoh did not command the sun would burn the crops. If he did not appease the river would drown the valley. This leaves us with a cold systemic reality. Egypt's stability was purchased through a monopoly on hope. By tethering the survival of the peasant to the divinity of the crown, the state transformed every ounce of human caloric energy into a monument of stone. Current Egyptological research, largely based on the analysis of settlement debris and osteological data from worker cemeteries, suggests that this social structure was maintained through a complex redistribution of rations rather than a simple system of forced labor. However, historians continue to debate whether this represented a genuine social contract of mutual benefit or a highly efficient mechanism of resource extraction that left the individual with no path outside the shadow of the palace. If the price of order was the total surrender of the self to the system, was the Golden Age a peak of human cooperation, or merely the world's first perfectly designed cage? Consider Akhenaten, a ruler often branded a heretic, but more accurately a systemic disruptor. In the reliefs of his time, he does not appear as a distant, idealized god. Instead, he is rendered with startling vulnerability, a protruding stomach, an elongated jaw, and hands that cradle his children. This was a radical break from 1,000 years of aesthetic tradition. Akhenaten chose to dismantle the entire religious bureaucracy of Amun, erasing the old gods to funnel all spiritual and economic capital toward a single point, the sun disk, A10. But a revolution of the mind requires a brutal reshaping of the earth. To manifest his vision, he ordered the construction of a new capital, Amarna, on a barren stretch of desert where nothing had ever grown. This was not merely a change of address, it was a forced migration of the state apparatus. The human cost of this theological pivot remained hidden for millennia, until the sand gave up the bones of the Amarna workers. Excavations in the city's commoner cemeteries reveal the skeletons of children and young adults with severe spinal lesions and stunted growth. Physical evidence of a population pushed beyond its biological limits to meet the frantic pace of the Pharaoh's new world. Akhenaten demonstrates the terrifying inertia of absolute idealism. He was not a traditional tyrant seeking personal wealth, but a visionary wielding a state machine that allowed for no friction. When an immovable conviction meets an absolute power, the individual human becomes a mere tool for the realization of a concept. While some scholars view this era as a precursor to monotheism or a golden age of artistic expression, a growing body of bioarchaeological evidence suggests that the rapid construction of Amarna resulted in an unprecedented period of physiological stress for the working class. This leads to a persistent historiographical debate. Was Akhenaten's reign a brief moment of intellectual enlightenment, or was it a logistical catastrophe fueled by the obsession of a single man? If a new truth is built on the broken backs of the next generation, does it remain true, or is it simply a different flavor of weight? 1213 BCE. The air in the delta is thick with the scent of palm wine and the acrid smoke of burning natron. Ramesses II is no longer a god. He is a problem of logistics. For 70 days, the embalmers work in a windowless room, their hands slick with resins as they extract the viscera, leaving only the heart, the supposed seat of weight and judgment. When the colossal stone slab of his tomb finally settles into place in the Valley of the Kings, the sound is more than a conclusion. It is a hairline fracture in the foundation of the state. For 66 years, Ramesses had been the sun around which the entire Egyptian machinery orbited. His death created a vacuum that no amount of gold could fill. The crown, laden with the expectations of an eternal bureaucracy, became a burden for those who followed. Men who inherited a treasury exhausted by monument building and a border that had grown too long to watch. On the horizon, the Mediterranean began to churn. Strange, iron-willed coalitions known as the Sea People appeared like a fever, their bronze swords gleaming as they tested the fraying edges of the empire. Egypt did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Instead, it suffered a systemic fatigue. The massive caloric surplus once used to raise obelisks was now diverted to a desperate, endless defense. The state was becoming a giant that had begun to consume its own muscle to keep its heart beating. As the central authority eroded, the very Ma'at, the cosmic order that held the Nile together, began to feel less like a divine truth and more like an expensive fiction. In the current historiographical discourse, the collapse of the late Bronze Age is often viewed as a systems collapse, where internal economic strain and external migrations collided. While traditional narratives focus on the heroism of later pharaohs like Ramesses III, many modern historians argue that the structural decay had become irreversible long before the first invader touched the shore. If a civilization's identity is built entirely on the permanence of its stones, what happens when the people living in their shadow can no longer afford the cost of their upkeep? The sheer scale of Egypt is a statistical anomaly. The Great Pyramid of Giza alone comprises over 2 million stone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons. A feat of engineering that remained the tallest man-made structure for nearly 4,000 years. Yet the true blueprint of this civilization is not found in the geometry of its peaks, but in the administrative papyri of Deir el-Medina. Here, the record shifts from divine decree to systemic friction. The workers, the very hands that carved the Valley of the Kings, documented the first recorded strikes in history. Their grievances were not ideological. They were physical. They wrote of grain rations that never arrived and eyes blinded by the relentless alkaline dust of the limestone pits. The vibrant blues and shimmering golds that coat the walls of the royal tombs were applied in a suffocating darkness, lit only by small linen wicks dipped in salt-treated oil. For the artists, the cost of creating an eternal heaven was a life spent inhaling soot and stone particulate, their lungs gradually thickening with the waste of their craft. Every ounce of gold that adorns the mask of Tutankhamun represents an aggressive expansion into the burning schist of the Nubian deserts. It was a cycle of extraction where human caloric output was the primary currency, and the state's appetite for mayat, or cosmic balance, required a staggering amount of earthly imbalance. This structural demand for perfection created a world of immense technical sophistication, yet one that was perpetually on the brink of exhaustion. We are forced to look past the aesthetics of the treasure and confront the mechanics of the empire. Was this a civilization that valued human life, or was it a machine that viewed humans as a renewable biological fuel for the production of stone immortality? While traditional narratives often emphasize the religious devotion of the labor force, modern archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from worker cemeteries shows high rates of degenerative joint disease and repetitive stress injuries. Among historians, it remains a subject of intense discussion whether this labor system was sustained by a shared religious conviction or by a sophisticated form of economic coercion that left the populace with no alternative for survival. If the greatness of a society is built on the systematic depletion of its people, is it a monument to human potential or a warning? Today, we stand in climate-controlled galleries, peering through reinforced glass at the preserved remains of the elite. To many, these mummified forms represent a triumph over biological decay, a testament to a civilization that refused to let death have the final word. But there is an unsettling dissonance in our gaze. The very bodies that were sealed in the deepest granite vaults to ensure eternal privacy are now global commodities, cataloged and illuminated for the curiosity of millions. The House of Eternity has become a public stage. The legacy of ancient Egypt is a ledger of staggering contradictions. They bequeathed us the foundations of the solar calendar, the mathematics of the triangle, and a literature that speaks of love with a startling modern intimacy. Yet they also left behind a blueprint for the most extreme form of centralized authority the world had ever seen. The pyramids are not just graves, they are the physical remains of a social machine that prioritized the collective myth over individual autonomy. We are left to grapple with a difficult calculation. Is the world measurably better because these monuments exist? If we could pull back the curtain of time, would we trade the majesty of the Sphinx for the quiet, unrecorded lives of the millions who spent their only existence serving a divine abstraction? There is no clean resolution. We find ourselves admiring the golden mask while recoil from the system that extracted it. We celebrate the cradle of civilization, even as we realize that the cradle was often a forge. In contemporary academic circles, the ethics of displaying human remains and the repatriation of Egyptian artifacts remain at the forefront of a global debate. While some argue that these displays provide invaluable scientific data and cultural education, a growing number of historians and ethicists suggest that the modern exhibition of mummies is a continuation of the same objectification that the state practiced 3,000 years ago, a perspective that continues to reshape how we engage with the past. If we cannot look at a pyramid without ignoring the shadow it cast over the living, have we truly understood the history, or are we simply seduced by the scale of the stone? As the sun dips below the horizon, the shadows of the pyramids stretch for miles, eventually engulfing the glass and steel of the modern skyline. These stones remain indifferent. They have watched empires assemble and dissolve like salt in the Nile, yet they stand as silent witnesses to a specific human obsession: the refusal to be forgotten. Today, we may not stack limestone to reach the heavens, but we construct our own versions of eternity. Global corporations, sprawling digital archives, and smart cities carved out of the wasteland. We are still a species that trades the finite energy of the living for the hope of a permanent footprint. 3,000 years from now, when the digital signals we emit today have finally gone silent, what will be left of our own golden age? Will we be remembered as the architects of a planetary consciousness, or merely as another society that exhausted its resources to sustain a myth of its own indispensability? Ancient Egypt proved that a civilization can achieve near-perfect stability for millennia, but only if its people are willing to become the mortar between the stones. It is a bargain that history has never stopped offering. Within the current study of collapsology, historians often look to the Nile Valley to understand how complex societies respond to environmental and systemic stress. While some scholars argue that the rigid structure of the pharaohs was the only way to prevent chaos in a desert climate, others suggest that this very rigidity ensured that when the end finally came, the collapse was total. This remains a central tension in our understanding of how high-functioning systems survive or fail. When you look into the hollowed, resin-soaked eyes of a king, you are not merely looking at a relic of a dead world. You are looking at a mirror. Are we watching a past that has been conquered? Or are we staring at the same driving fear that fuels our own desire to build, to own, and to outlast? If the price of immortality is the total absorption of the present, is anything we build ever truly worth the weight of the sand?